Tara Brabazon, and it's my great pleasure to once again be talking with the extraordinarily fabulous Professor Priscilla Dunk-West, Professor and Head of Social Work at Victoria University. And look, there's a bit of a focus of our conversation this week, and once more I'll be reliant on her expertise. And this was a very interesting conversation we had that we thought we would share with all of you. We're both very interested in NTROs, and it looks like NTROs have found their moment. Non-traditional research outputs. They've been in the scholarly news for the last 6 weeks or so because ORCID, the Open Researcher and Contributor ID, has just confirmed that NTROs can be added to a researcher's entry. And this adds credibility and verification to NTROs, and can I say, it's about time. So traditional research outputs encompass scholarly monographs, edited books and book chapters, refereed articles, conference proceedings. But what makes the traditional research outputs traditional is they're not only published, but they have a quality assurance protocol, like, for example, peer review. And there is also an enhancement stage, I think, as well, through editing, copy editing, design and so forth. A traditional research publication must show scholarly activity like a literature review, use citations and footnotes, and demonstrate the historical legacy of the work. There's also got to be some originality there, so it's not simply a recutting of existing work. It's moved through peer review, it increases our knowledge, and it's in a format that enables dissemination. NTROs are intriguing because they confirm that there are alternative ways of completing research, including research reports to external bodies, portfolios, live performances of creative works, recorded creative works, curated public exhibition events, original creative works, and of course journalism. And NTROs can exist in all disciplines. And they share two characteristics, I think, with publications. The first is that the research must be publicly available, and the second is it's created by authors. NTROs confirm that there are so many different ways of doing knowledge beyond the traditional old scholarly modes, and NTROs don't slot into rankings or tiers of journals or citation indices. They're not disciplined by gatekeepers. Well, they may be, but they're different gatekeepers, and they are research outputs that are really innovative in form and content and how form and content align. So now that research assessments such as the ERA or the REF are either permanently parked or a whole series of academics are no longer in the denominator, so they're suddenly no longer required for the research metric, then flexibility returns to our research portfolio. And I would argue that the arbitrary division between traditional research and the NTRO is weakening. University research management practices, that is our research ecosystem, is a structure. And it's a structure of measurements, of databases, of data sets. It's a reporting machine. Therefore, research variables have to fit into it rather than the system being both porous and flexible enough to grasp the diversity of research modes. NTROs, I think, will challenge our research ecosystem for publications, for funding, for research rankings, and also citations. So, look, enough of me. Let's talk with Priscilla and discover how her view of NTROs may transform what we consider social work research. We've had some fantastic conversations since we've commenced our more public relationship, because we've sort of followed each other through multiple universities in the last few years.
Yes.
But one of our big interests is NTROs, non-traditional research outputs. Some people refer to them as objects. And what I think triggered our conversation a few weeks ago is ORCID is now including NTROs in its listing. which I think is an absolute game changer. So why do you think in 2025 this is the moment for NTROs? Why now?
It's really interesting, isn't it? And also fabulous about Orchid doing that. And I think we're starting to think more carefully about knowledge and about constructions of knowledge, and particularly in social work, we're interested in constructions of knowledge and expertise and who's the expert, and really decentering the expert in some ways to allow for lived experience, right? So to hear from people who have traditionally been neglected in research. It's interesting, this is kind of a bit of a stretch, but it reminds me of when I was in practice. I worked as a sexual health counsellor, and I used to talk to clients, or the people with whom I worked with people with whom I worked, about research and about theory. And often we think that research has to sit in the expert's mind and that they carry it around with them. But one way that I used to do my practice is to talk to people about theories, talk to people about research. And so it was a way of disseminating research findings to make a difference to people's day-to-day lives in terms of shifting how they thought or offering an alternative framework for somebody. And so I think that's continued with me into my academic life. And so I think it's time. Maybe it's because of the internet and the democratisation of knowledge. Maybe it's because we're more aware of, violent processes through colonisation. Maybe it's because we're thinking about power and inequality, but maybe it's a perfect storm. But all of these things seem to have contributed to the positioning of research as not sitting in some space that's inaccessible to other people, and that it becomes a really important process whereby, the privilege that we have as researchers is made available to people to whom research should matter.
Oh, that's brilliant. I hadn't thought about it in that way. And we've been talking about interfaces this morning, so interface, that's our new word. But John Urry's great work on mobility and the movement of ideas. I think we focus a lot in globalisation on the movement of people or the movement of money. But I think the careful and considered movement of ideas is absolutely crucial. And look, you and I, as you've just talked about in that answer, you and I are pretty fascinated about new ways of thinking about research dissemination and widening the dissemination to a great diversity of audiences and citizens in particular. What role do you think NTROs can and in fact should play in a methodical and careful dissemination strategy for researchers?
Well, I think, let's face it, very few people read journal articles. There's a very small amount of nerds like you and I, probably, who enjoy reading journal articles. They're formulaic. They're not massively creative. They follow, a particular structure. And I've always been really interested in writing to an audience where you have an audience who doesn't necessarily want to wade through that structure to get to what they need to know, right? And so non-traditional research outputs could be a practice guide, could be we did this research and this is what people said. I mean, I remember doing some research with a colleague looking at positive post-separation parenting and came up with a guide because we asked our participants, what do you want to tell other people about what works for you when you're parenting after separation and your positive experiences of that? And so it was just a guide that I put together where it was basically participants talking to people who might be interested in this knowledge. It's a PDF. It's so been accessed by so many people, and that's just a really simple example of the way that we can facilitate a bridge, or here we go, our interface idea. We can be an interface between the people with whom we do research and the people who might be interested in that research. So it could be through an exhibition, it could be through a practice guide, it could be through a blog post, it could be through a podcast. So all of those things, it could be through, talking to a journalist and putting something in mainstream media. It's just ways to find accessible means to access the knowledge and the beauty of people's narratives that we hear about through research.
That's amazing to me. My old teaching line used to be talk to people where they are rather than where I want them to be. And isn't that interesting if we move that from an andragogy to a research dissemination strategy, that we've got to assume that everybody is like us and everybody's got these particular academic literacies, and we're building the scaffolding and the interfaces through multimodality. And I think NTROs are a great example of that. But that's why I'm particularly wanting to talk about social work, because it has got a whole series of ethical considerations, professional considerations that other areas and other disciplines don't have. So could you tell us a little bit about how NTROs will work for social work and perhaps more widely going into allied health?
I think in social work we have I always think this is at the heart of our profession, is this idea of social justice. And social justice in particular is interested in the ways that power is expressed through relationships, through networks, the way that it's accessed. And so we should be interested in inequalities, and we should be applying that lens through research. And I've recently written a book with a colleague that connects up the aims of qualitative research with social work values and ethics. Wow. And we argue that it's super important that the research that we do makes a difference somehow. And that's not to be utilitarian about research. It's not to ignore theoretical advances through, scholarship, but it's to say, if people tell us our stories, we have a responsibility to do good, right? Yeah. We have a responsibility to utilise those stories to help other people. And going back to what you were saying before about, starting where people are at, often everybody's doing the best they can with what they've got, right? And so if we can offer an alternative perspective for somebody that draws from other people's lived experiences and that's beneficial to somebody else, then we ought to be doing that. And so that kind of positions research as a doing, right? So potentially in social work as a doing practice. It's absolutely important to practice.
Oh, I think that's extraordinary. And I've been terribly interested and terribly moved in the last 6 months in particular about the research that's emerging on aloneness and on loneliness. And obviously part of that is the explosion of homelessness that exists in particular sociological groups such as women in their 50s. But the aloneness and the loneliness, and the one variable about NTROs, particularly if it is a podcast or it is an easily available PDF, it can slot into people's lives in a non-invasive way. It can exist and they can download it, and it can be like a marinade in their daily experience, not invasive, not judgy, not sort of aggressively teacherly, but sitting where they are and providing meaning and company.
And an alternative perspective. I think there's a danger at the moment of going down a path. People talk about living in bubbles, and I think the algorithms help us do that, right? We are exposed to information that we agree with, we access that information, then we're exposed to more information that we agree with. Yeah. And so there is a kind of intellectual loneliness, I guess, if you are in those bubbles. And hearing a diversity of experiences, I think, it enriches people's lives and potentially mitigates against the effects of loneliness. Because we need those social bonds. We need that social interaction. And I agree with you. I think that accessing a podcast, accessing research through another means, whether it's, by reading a newspaper report or listening to the radio, that's an example of connection, social connectedness, I think, because it is that interaction between knowledge and people's viewpoints and lived experience, and it's that interaction which is social interaction.
I think that's delightful. You've convinced me already But let's therefore get to the crunchy bit, and can I say to all the wonderful social workers who listened to our last podcast, which was absolutely amazing, but I will just ask a further question for our social worker colleagues. What sort of NTROs do you think are most appropriate for social work, particularly noting ethics and privacy and being, careful and cautious about the pathways of people's stories? What do you think are the best NTROs that social workers, students and researchers could use?
So there's one national social work podcast that I know about that a colleague in another state produces. So podcasts are great, I think. Engagement with the media, often social workers are reluctant to comment on things that they may have expertise on. So for example, talking about, when I was in practice, people would tell me this. So not betraying somebody's confidence or confidentiality, but actually being able to draw from existing research and practice experience to speak authoritatively on behalf of other people, but to be ethical around that, obviously. And I think any other creative way that people can think about, in practice, social workers might be working in a group with people with, scissors and pencils and paper and, using creative methods to engage with people. We can use those in research. So we can have participants create, something that then gets exhibited, for example, to the general public. That's a non-traditional way to communicate people's experiences and perspectives in a way that's sort of, doesn't look at all like traditional research. So the potentials are to connect up social work practice with what people are doing in their practice or have done in their practice with translating research into a non-traditional kind of output.
You are changing my life this morning. Can I say there's a lot of stuff, and I do one of my weird sort of Tara Brabazon faces. There's a lot of stuff about co-design, and I think a bunch of people, that's on sort of your bingo card, right? So when in doubt, let's tick that box for co-design. But can I say what you've just talked about there through NTROs is authentic co-design and meaningful co-design. So through multimodality, we can do that. And so, look, our final question, and I've learnt this, I'm going to be listening to this on my walks to avoid loneliness and isolation through much of the next fortnight. But why do you think that when we're enacting research training in Australia, around the world, that so rarely we talk about NTROs? And how do you think we can assist our higher degree students, but also our earlier career researchers, to invest in what is now a verified mode of thinking about research dissemination?
I think that the way that research has been done is a very established traditional pathway, right? And it's sort of like when you come into research as a PhD student or a research student, you come into it and you learn it, and people say, no, well, this is, you do research and this is how you do it, and so there hasn't necessarily been a massive shift in what we're doing, right? So we're still doing that research. The difference is all of those things that I talked about before, the kind of coming together of the positioning of knowledge, access to knowledge. I mean, the internet has given everybody unprecedented access to knowledge. We all just use it to watch, cat videos and things, but, it's there at our fingertips. We can access research in ways that we could never before, and so that has really democratised research. I think that there's potentials to do research dissemination in ways that are new but also emerging. So the sky's the limit, and maybe we look to our colleagues in the arts and humanities and look to understand research in that broader environment. Let's not pretend that there isn't a kind of very white, middle class, potentially male version of research, which is about, quantitative research, positivistic ways of thinking, that have really dominated this terrain. And so maybe part of it was that historically non-traditional outputs were seen as a bit Mickey Mouse, was seen as a little bit, that's not proper research, that's not the real stuff, it's not serious. And so I think there's been a kind of undervaluing of that. And I think that there's lots of potential to think about what people want, what the need is, what people are asking for. And then that other thing that I was talking about connecting a research population with a broader public.
I think this is the moment. I think 2025, we're recording this, in February 2025. ORCID made their decision right at the end of January 2025. This is the time. So I think the notion that research training can continue to focus on scholarly monographs and on refereed articles, which you and I both believe in very, very strongly.
Absolutely.
But we now need to, in a very straightforward fashion, talk about video abstracts, talk about podcasts, talk about posters and those multimodal visual interfaces in all sorts of new ways. So Priscilla, I really thank you so much for that, and for all our wonderful social workers and colleagues, particularly in the applied social sciences. We thank you so much for spending some time with us during your walk or your commute. But thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you.